Welcome to this webinar. We're going to start now. We waited a few minutes. I think we can go ahead and start. So again, if you need interpretation, the option is available. This webinar, looking into intersectional perspective on social protections in Lebanon, is part of our ongoing work on social justice in the region. This is part of a project we're doing with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation called Advancing a Social Welfare State and Social Justice in Lebanon, which aims to produce transformative research for action, including policy briefs, infographics, media stories. So before we start with the presentation, we're going to show you a little teaser of a video story that will be out very soon in regional and local media first, and then international media. Madeleine, can you please show the video? Let's hope we won't have technical issues.
ما بقى في الواحد يكفي حاله. هيدا عنده عيال وهيدا عنده عيال. من مين بدك تاخدي من بدك تعطي؟
أنا أوقات ما بتصدق إنه governments ممكن عن جد يساعدوا ويدعموا لأنه you don't have it and you've never seen it first hand.
ما فيني أعمل شيء، عاجزة، ما بقدر سافر، ما بقدر أطلع وأرجع.
تنكسري على جمعة تجمعي حق كيس الغسيل، تنكسري على جمعة تجيبي حق قلن الزيت. هاللي بيطلع بالجمعين بتروحي تحطين كلن ما بيكفوا.
So this gives us a nice little intro to the state of lack of social protection in Lebanon and how it affects people. So we can move to the presentation by Dr. Michele Scala, who is an associate lecturer at Sciences Po Lyon, an associate researcher with IFPO Beirut, and one of our very own researchers at the center. Michele will present the policy brief that's being currently finalized and will be out also very soon. Michele?
Yes, hi to everyone. Thank you, Leah. So it is of course my pleasure to be presenting this policy brief on social protection in Lebanon, and I thank you all for attending this session. I will start by saying that the gaps of the social protection system in Lebanon have been widely discussed within a quite broad literature that has pointed out structural shortcomings of the social protection system in Lebanon, including, for instance, the impact of the neoliberal political economy that has pushed social policies to the margins of the political and policy agendas, but also, for instance, the way in which the fragmentation or the inefficiency of the social protection system has nourished the rise of a sectarian welfare, making of social service an instrument of clientelist machines and a key of sectarian domination of the society. In fact, it has already been pointed out by some scholars that assistance is the strongest means of propaganda. Moreover, lately, several technical analyses have been published by experts and international organizations proposing way forward to reform the current scattered social protection system in Lebanon. So the question would be here, why to propose or, let's say, inflict to the readers another study, okay? Hasn't everything been said about social protection system in Lebanon? Well, our findings show that an important political and sociological perspective has been quite absent from studies and reports produced so far, and namely an intersectional perspective attempting to replace and understand the inclusionary and exclusionary mechanisms of the current social protection system within a wider context of social and political hierarchies. The work that I will be presenting today is therefore built around such an attempt, and I will try to show how the social protection system in Lebanon produces and reproduces political and social hierarchies, feeding into discriminations based on class, gender, ethnicity, work and residency status, as well as age and disability-related discriminations. As a result, and I'm jumping in such a way to my conclusions, in proposing ways forward to reform, we do highlight in this policy brief that there is a necessity to link the reform of the social protection system to other interrelated policies concerning, for instance, labor rights, as access to residency, and migration policies. In other words, if the social protection systems reveal and nourish intersectional exclusionary mechanisms, any attempt to reform it needs to be accompanied by interrelated social policies able to contribute to the elimination of such forms of intersectional discrimination in the wider context of the society. As per the structure of the Lebanese social protection system, just a few words, we know that the current social protection system is based on a contributory system covering active workers in the formal, private, and public sectors, and on the other hand, on ad hoc service provisions for vulnerable populations that are mostly funded through, but not limited to, external donors' support, and notably the World Bank. However, a large part of social services targeting vulnerable populations are dispatched through humanitarian aid, while the so-called sectarian welfare, made of services offered by and through parties and religious institutions, constitute a very important share of social services offered in the country, a share that is, of course, difficult to quantify and that follows clientelist patterns and arrangements. However, being mostly based on a contributory system, the main pillar of the formal social protection system in Lebanon is still the social security schemes for formal employees of the private and public sectors. Let's also notice that in terms of benefits and coverage, public sector employees are better covered than their private sector peers, as they are not linked to the National Social Security Fund, but rather to cooperatives that ensure, among other benefits, a retirement pension, for instance, while, as we know, private sector employees only receive end-of-service indemnities that are indeed very weak and equal 3 years of salaries for a 40 years service activity. So let's also notice that comparatively to other countries of the Middle East and North Africa, the public sector in Lebanon is very small, and this makes of public sector employees a very small, privileged labor population that has, as we will further see, nowadays entered the subaltern classes because of the multi-layered ongoing crisis and, of course, the depreciation of their salaries. In assessing gaps of the social protection system, of course, the main gap is self-evident as it is linked to the labor-based architecture of social security schemes. According to pre-crisis data, for instance, that is data pertaining, of course, to the pre-2019 situation, informality concerns between 55 and 66% of the active population following estimates of the ILO and the World Bank, which means that these workers are excluded from accessing social security schemes. However, in order to better seize what this data indicate, we should consider at least 3 things. First of all, that informality does not constitute an exceptional, but rather a structural dimension of the Lebanese labor market, which challenges the labor-based architecture of the social security system itself. And secondly, needless to say, consistently with the deterioration of the economic situation throughout the last 2 years, these figures have, in all likelihood, largely worsened in a context characterized by business closures and massive layoffs, as well as abusive wage cuts or suspensions. And thirdly, and this is more important for the analysis that I would like to propose today, it must also be noticed that informal workers are not the only ones who are excluded from accessing social security schemes. In fact, on one hand, avoidance of enrollment to formal security, which is the NSSF, especially in the private sector, is a widespread practice in the Lebanese context. And on the other hand, certain occupational categories are excluded, be it de jure or de facto, from the possibility to actually access formal social security schemes. If we look at those excluded occupational categories, we immediately see that they concern specific social groups, and that their exclusion also reflects class, gender, and ethnic hierarchies that characterize the Lebanese polity more in general. In fact, Article 7 of the Labor Code excludes from its regulation agricultural workers, domestic workers, and daily workers employed in the public sector. As it is well known, for instance, domestic workers constitute an occupational category that employs female foreign workers, especially Southeast Asian and Sub-Saharan and East African female workers subject to the kafala system. However, it must be noted that this sector has historically employed foreign female workers, such as Syrians, Kurdish, as well as Palestinians and Egyptian workers in the past. This shows that, or let's say how the exclusion of this specific occupational category is intimately linked to gender and ethnic dimensions. As per agricultural workers, we know that this sector has historically mobilized a large foreign workforce, and namely a Syrian workforce that, at least prior to the Syrian crisis of 2011, was mostly employed on a seasonal basis. To that, we must add that several limitations to access professions are imposed to both Palestinians and Syrians, which pushes them to integrate the informal sector. As per Palestinians, for instance, a ministerial decree states that they cannot work in as many as 70 professions and cannot own property, which further undermines their business development capacity. While as per Syrians, starting by 2012, different ministerial circulars published yearly specify that they can only operate in 3 sectors, which are agriculture, construction, and services. All 3 sectors being either excluded from the labor code, as it is the case for agricultural workers, or historically characterized by a high rate of informality. As per construction, for instance, we know that as an average in Arab countries, about 95% of workers of the construction sector work informally. As per daily workers, also excluded from the Article 7 of the Labor Code in Lebanon, they operate within public institutions, companies, and administration. And different accounts have shown that they are overwhelmingly Lebanese and low or middle skilled, and that their employment is subject to clientelist arrangements and work exploitation, leading, among other things, to very weak salaries ranging around 28 Lebanese pounds per working day. Within the public sector, we should also know that daily workers constitute at least 10% of public workers, and that this figure increases up to 50%, 70%, and even 80% in certain public facilities, as some public hospitals, some public companies, and municipalities as well. In other words, these few examples suggest that inclusion or exclusion from social security schemes can not only be explained through the belonging to the formal or to the informal workforce, since other articulated patterns of domination and discrimination are entangled to the exclusionary mechanisms at stake within the society and the labor market itself, in fact, and namely gender, ethnic, class, and other patterns. This shows, on the one hand, that it is necessary to disembed, I would say, the analysis of exclusionary mechanisms from the social security system from a straightforward labor perspective. And on the other, that it is important to integrate a more articulated intersectional analysis, taking into account the way in which social, economic, and political identities participate to the exclusion of individuals and populations from protections. This also shows the necessity to articulate a reform of the social protection system to other interrelated social policies pertaining to labor and migration issues and stages. A last point that is worth mentioning about access to social security schemes of non-Lebanese populations concern the benefits they can actually access in case they would be able to find formal employment in the private sector, which is, of course, seldomly the case. This concerns what I would call hierarchical citizenships, because, and firstly, as we know, access to the NSSF benefits is subject to the reciprocity principle, which means that only citizens of countries that allow Lebanese to access social security schemes can be covered through the Lebanese NSSF. This principle is, however, subject to some exceptions, as French, Italian, Belgian, and English citizens are not subject to this principle and can access NSSF benefits just basing on their nationality. While on the other hand, all other foreign citizens operating a formal job can only access end-of-service indemnities and are excluded from other benefits offered through the NSSF. In the same time, employers and employees are supposed to provide full contributions to the NSSF. This actually means that as the end-of-service indemnity constitute about half of the contribution paid to the NSSF by employers and employees, the NSSF would be actually making profit out of foreign workers' contributions in case the latter pay their contributions being integrated within the formal private sector. What is equally important in this account is that it shows how the social security system structurally produces or reproduces hierarchical citizenships within the society, sanctioning, on one hand, the existence of exceptional nationalities in the double meaning that this expression conveys, which are, as we have seen, French, Italians, Belgian, and English citizens. And on the other hand, it allows a higher level of protection to nationals, at least on the paper. Nationals, I mean, of course, Lebanese. But this is important to stress that this sort of Lebanese protectionism is only theoretical, because in fact, the reality shows that prior to the 2019 crisis, 1 of 3 Lebanese was actually excluded from any form of social security schemes, and that 2 out of 3 non-Lebanese were similarly excluded from mandatory social security schemes, which shows again how the contributory system is widely ineffective for Lebanese citizens as well. Of course, the wide exclusion of foreigners from the mandatory social security schemes is the easiest to access within the gaps of the social protection system in Lebanon. However, data indicate that other transversal patterns of discrimination participate to the exclusion of Lebanese and non-Lebanese individuals from accessing formal social benefits and provisions. A very visible pattern of exclusion is that of class. The pattern of class can perhaps better than others highlight the actual effects of the lack of a universal social protection system in Lebanon. In fact, and very logically, in contributory systems of social protections, benefits tend to be distributed proportionally to income and proportionally to contributions. Being tied to the individual income of members, that is, to the individual capacity of contribution of members, the current social protection system actually structurally strengthens class inequalities in Lebanon. As a result, ILO data referring again to the pre-crisis situation show that more than 60% of all social protection benefits, excluding private insurance, went to individuals in the richest income quintile of the ILO sample. Hence, the current social protection system largely fails to protect most in need population, thus deepening social, political, and economic exclusionary mechanisms already at stake in the Lebanese society. Another important perspective is, of course, that of gender. Let's just quote three aspects, although much more should be said on this point. The current system is based on a patriarchal model of the male breadwinner. And in practice, this entails that, first of all, women registered to the NSSF can only access child allowances if their husband is not and cannot be registered to the NSSF. Secondly, the NSSF does not provide any paternity leave and allowance, which implicitly admit that the woman must be the one who takes care of the children. And thirdly, active women retiring within 12 months following their marriage can access end of service indemnities, which pushes them to leave work and lose access to their benefits. Other overlapping patterns that contribute to the integration or exclusion of individuals to the scattered Lebanese social protection system can be assessed through an analysis of the social safety net programs that constitute the second main pillar of the formal social protection system. That is, as we have seen, ad hoc provisions for vulnerable populations. Three safety net programs currently exist or are meant to be implemented in Lebanon, which are the National Program Targeting Poverty, the Emergency Social Safety Net, and the Ration Card programs. However, only one of them has been actually implemented, which is the NPTP. Although its outreach capacity is very modest up to this day, since only around 3.5% of the population has actually access to its provisions. As we know, lately the Da'an platform has been launched, which will take registration for the implementation of the SSSN and the ration card programs. However, we do not know anything about when and how the program will actually start and how it will be financed, and there are other technical issues that are still at stake. However, as per the NPTP, that is the only one that can be actually assessed to up to this day, as a matter of fact, impact of the ongoing ad hoc provisions for vulnerable population is totally negligible, as it would account for less than 0.5 percentage point increase of targeted households' income, which is around 0.5% income increase for each household, which is really negligible. It is also worth mentioning that the best safety net programs have exclusionary errors of up to 44%. And then let's not forget also that eligibility criteria for such programs are oftentimes based on complex and obscure calculations, contributing directly to produce additional forms of discrimination based on eligible poors and not eligible poors, or differently said, on deserving and non-deserving poors. This also stems from, of course, a specific charity-based perspective that is also a static one on poverty, as crises have shown us elsewhere and more recently in Lebanon. The so-called poor is a fluid social category which entails social class downgrading, notably due to job loss and currency devaluation. So a class downgrading that pertains to individuals and households that are being pushed into poverty. Just to make a few examples about these safety net programs, let's note that the ASSN that will be maybe implemented at a certain point will exclude households with individuals presenting disabilities that are not classified as severe, households with a retiree who is aged among 64 and 70, which means that only households hosting retirees aged above 70 are actually eligible. And moreover, let's also notice that households where no one is employed are more likely than other households to access benefits derived from, for instance, UNHCR and other UN and NGOs health programs. Therefore, almost all and every informal non-Lebanese worker virtually has few chances to access these programs if they declare to be working in the informal sector, which explains why they usually do not declare to be working in order to circumvent this eligibility criteria. As a result, most vulnerable populations are largely excluded from any form of social protection, which shows articulated patterns of intersectional discrimination. In conclusion, the fragmentation of the social protection system not only strengthens social inequalities by ensuring better forms of protections to those able to contribute to social security scheme through labor and leaving behind those who cannot find or perform formal jobs, but it also reveals deepest patterns of discriminations based on social, political, and economic identities. Vulnerable populations subject to different and sometimes overlapping forms of domination, such as refugees and other non-Lebanese populations, but also women, older persons, persons with disability, as well as Lebanese and non-Lebanese informal workers, are those who benefit the least, in fact, of the Lebanese scattered social protection system. I will now skip directly to some recos because I've already taken quite a long time. I would just like to say that the current fragmented social protection system in Lebanon has proven to be largely ineffective, being unable to protect at least 1 in 3 Lebanese and 1 in 2 non-Lebanese citizens, while also bolstering class inequalities and other intersectional discriminations. This calls for a universal and unified social security scheme thought as a cornerstone of a right-based social policy in the country that ensures on the short-term protection against crisis and life shocks and on the longer-term welfare and prosperity. I will highlight some main recommendations of our policy brief. As per the Lebanese state, it should develop, along with syndicates, workers' groups, and civil society actors, as well as other stakeholders, a comprehensive national and universal social security framework, aiming at the merging of all social protection schemes in one unified fund that would ensure universal and equal benefits and coverage. Some intermediary steps could be implemented, such as the reform of the NSSF to ensure universal coverage, retirement pensions, and unemployment allowances that are currently in existence. While some interrelated policies might tackle a reform of the labor regulations in line with international conventions, encouraging the inclusion of all categories of workers through namely the reform of the labor code that should entail at least the elimination of the Article 7 that exclude some occupational categories from its regulation, but also the elimination of Article 86 subordinating the establishment of trade unions to a ministerial authorization, and the reform of Articles 91 and 92, allowing, therefore, foreigners to fully participate and be represented within trade unions. Another policy that should be implemented concerns the elimination of prescriptions for Palestinians and Syrian citizens, limiting the sectors and professions in which they can operate right now. And of course, the elimination of labor-related residency policies, namely the kafala system that ties foreign workers to one employer, limiting free circulation in the labor market and favoring forms of discrimination and exploitation of foreign workers, especially but not limited to female foreign domestic workers. As per the donor community and international NGOs, they should support the Lebanese state in the policy reform process towards the unification of the existing exclusionary schemes towards a unified social security program for all. They should also promote a structural approach to social protection reform, which is based on human rights and universal coverage rather than on an emergency-based approach favoring ad hoc provisions such as safety net programs. Therefore, funds and loans should be allocated accordingly. And they should also commit to full transparency in the allocation and reporting of funding for social security given to the Lebanese state and other stakeholders by promoting, namely, consultative processes that are effectively participatory and include labor and civic actors' voiced priorities and needs. As per civil society, it should reclaim advocacy and lobbying efforts and campaigning on social and economic rights, notably the access to social security, beyond or in complementarity with their provision of social services. Civil society should also advocate and lobby for the introduction of a national social protection strategy that mitigates the effects of current compounding crisis and aims for enactment of a universal social security scheme on the long term. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Michele, for this presentation that's very exhaustive of the policy brief. We'll move now to the questions. If anyone has any, you can unmute yourself or raise your hand and we'll unmute you. If you have any question or anything to share with us and with Michele. Jimmy, please go ahead.
Yes, hi everyone. First of all, thank you for the research and presentation. I just have a couple of quick questions. Maybe it will kick off the discussion. So one question is mostly about the new clientelist networks, which emerged after October 17, the collapse and everything. A lot of people which were able to move out of the sectarian familial patronage networks into more solidarity-based ones had to revert back to the old networks, and this had a tremendous impact on the marginalized communities. So do you have any data or insight on how people are dealing with this, how networks are being renewed? Is it, as it is being said now, cheaper to maintain the networks because of the collapse and all of that? So this is one question. Another question is, and I don't know if you have the data on this, it's mostly to hit back at the critique which says that universal coverage cannot be funded, especially amid the collapse, incoming IMF austerity measures, and all of that. So do you have an approach or quick guidelines or insight on where the money can actually come from for that? And thank you again.
Yes, very good questions to which I unfortunately have very few answers. As per the question of the renewal or how to say the deepening of old and new clientelist patterns to access social protection, this is really, I think, a very central issue because, as we all know, the CeSSRA pointed out, how to say, the fact that these clientelist patterns were unequal and corrupted and unjust, and so one of the main claims was precisely that of bringing down the clientelist patterns and the machines through bringing down the system itself. And so, which is very, very, how to say, sad to see is that right now, in the situation of deteriorating economic situation, etc., the rare resources that are left are still in the hand of the religious and religious associations and political parties, especially. So it is very difficult to know if this will be strengthening the clientelist patterns or not. Because I think that there is something that has definitely happened, that is an open and very strong critique to these patterns and arrangements. So it is difficult to know to which extent passing through clientelist patterns will also translate into a renewal of political loyalties, or to what extent this is instrumental, let's say. However, really, I think that it is very much important to make inquiries about this. We couldn't do that until now, but we will definitely try to do that, because otherwise it's difficult to give an answer to this question, which is a very, very central one, I think. Broad, I mean, not only as per social protection issues, but also more generally for political issues and the development of the country in the upcoming years. And as per the critique brought to the universal coverage that cannot be financed, as we know, this is of course not true, because several technical reports have been published from experts that are better placed than myself to propose a financial plan to the founding of universal coverage, that have shown how the existing resources are more than enough to actually finance a universal coverage, and several options have been written down by experts on this point. So this, of course, the ILO report, it has been lately, it's been published lately. So I mean, the question of funding is not there, also because external donors are supporting with many millions of dollars other safety nets and emergency-based programs, which show that loans can be allocated, and they should be allocated accordingly to a wider perspective on social protection that is not based on an emergency response, but rather to the universal coverage scheme, which is the only one that can actually mitigate poverty, and it's the actual one, especially that will participate to eliminate inequalities within the polity through social protection. Social protection is just a means of reducing inequalities within a society. It's not the only answer. It's a mean. Thank you. I hope I did answer to your questions.
Okay, so I see two hands raised, Marie Noel and then Randa Alatinji.
Okay, shall I start? It's Randa. Okay, I have very few comments, but several. Very short. The problem of funding is very essential in my point, because there is a time when you require some require some cover, you have to make sure that everyone is paying for it. And as long as a community or as a group or as a fund member, you do not pay for it, you always think that someone from outside has to help me and give me emergency funds. So I will come back to this and say, the funding of the Social Security Fund is very easy, I agree. There is a lot of money for it, but it's fragmented. And we always say when it's fragmented, it means that it's clientelist or it is confessional. No, it's fragmented also in corporations because doctors are not insured, lawyers are not insured, and everyone else who is in high income is not insured. Moreover, employees in companies, when they have a very high salary, the salary contribution is capped to the Social Security. So what we know today is we have a Social Security fund, which is essentially based on the main employee who contributes, excuse me. So the main employee, there is a single person in the family, in the household, who contributes for the whole family. It's usually in the poorer category of the income in the companies. This person is paying the whole amount, and then all of the people who are extremely rich, all of the people who have high salaries, all of the people who are in other corporations are excluded. And if we speak, for example, for agriculture, if you are not an employee, all the agriculture engineers, all of the people who work in the agriculture sector in companies are included in the order of engineers, but all the employees of the sector are excluded, and we have created some mutual funds and sanadik ta'adud. This is a deliberate fragmentation because what we do is pressure groups are already, I would say, paid or given a reward so that they do not get for the whole group or for their all constituents, etc. The problem is, and this is why I say we all have to pay, it has to be universal, it has to be compulsory, because there are so many people in Lebanon, so many groups who do not identify with the Social Security. They do not think it is some mechanism for them because they can either go through their orders or go through private insurance. And therefore, they do not make any recommendations for transformation of this. So the smart people, the educated people, the needy people eventually are, sorry, not the needy, the people who can understand the concept of universal social security are deliberately excluded so that the poor remain fighting for something that they will never get. I finished.
Thank you for this comment. I do agree with you, but again, I think that I have nothing to add to what you said. In fact, I just think that this is a political approach, first of all, towards social protection, to put forward a universal perspective on the reform, and the technical issues can be therefore solved if there is a real political approach and a real political priority that is made for universal coverage on social protection. Marie-Noël, maybe you had...
Yes, thank you. Thank you a lot, Michele. I think Randa covered a lot of the points I wanted to say on point number 2, but allow me a small pet peeve of mine, being a researcher focusing on social movements. I think we always tend to, especially when we are sympathetic to a collective action or a social movement, we tend to kind of reify it. But I think it is always important to rethink these movements in a longer temporality, but also in a processual manner. I think what's important in the October 2099 movement, the so-called Thawra, for sympathizers, but for us scholars, it's merely a social movement, and this is up for debate, but maybe not within this webinar, is to, on the one hand, reactualize, as Michele said, I think, socioeconomic grievances, but also demands for a certain welfare state, demands that, and I love this expression by Randa, I don't know if it's yours or you're quoting someone, demands basically that for once appear to be unified due to this deliberate fragmentation, or for us social movement researchers, this sectorization of demands basically. And that it was a moment where we felt that there was a desectorization, where people from varying socioeconomic backgrounds, varying professions, appeared to be united around the same grievances, notably socioeconomic ones. And to go back to Jimmy's comment on the rejection of the clientelistic networks, yes, but I think I think from my point of view that it was justement part of this framing of this grievance and demand for a welfare state, demands to deconstruct or get over or reject the patron-client model versus a citizenship welfare state model were set forth. However, the crisis has reshaped things, and I don't think we can basically I don't know how to say this in English, project our own expectations or our own wishful to a social movement that is at the end of the day composed of people who are crumbling under the weight of multiple crises. And at the end of the day, I mean, we see it today. We're at the center, we're mapping collective actions. And we've seen from 2019 till today how the number of mobilization is also diminishing. And I think this says a lot on the difficulties that people are having to get by daily. But moving on to the issue of funding, and here I don't completely agree with Randa, I think. And I think I would say that ideally, and I think our colleague from Development Pathways, Shahir, can add to this because they worked so much on the costing and the funding globally, but also in the Middle East of social protection, and notably universal and inclusive social protection. I think that what we ideally want to strive for is a multi-tiered, a hybrid system, whereby, yes, we want universal protection for everyone, but not everyone can afford to pay all the time. I mean, today I'm employed, I might be out of my job tomorrow. I will not be able to contribute. So yes, it implies on the one hand, a fiscality reform, where everyone who can afford, ideally progressively, would contribute to this universalist system, but also this system should be thought of and implemented in complementarity with social assistance schemes and programs that, contrary to what is being done at the moment with the ESSN, the ration card, catastrophic charity piecemeal increasing fragmentation, and corroborating how we think of the poor, how we define these poor people, undeserving poor, and contrary to those who deserve protection. So I think what we need is to rethink, without sounding too utopist, to rethink what kind of a state we want at the moment where everything is collapsing in the country. I'm agreeing with you, great, maybe I misunderstood. How what kind of a state we want, what kind of a relationship we want as citizens with the state. And I think when we kind of agree on that, it will trickle down. But I would love to hear Shahir if he wants to on the funding. Thank you. Sorry if I was long.
Thank you. Yes, maybe just a few words, because of course I do agree with you about the question of social movements. This is something that we developed a little bit in the policy brief that will be published shortly, but I didn't have time to talk about that. However, just very quick, I think that ثورة أو انتفاضة أو حراك أو أي شيء ثاني حسب العبارات has told us at least two things, which were a little bit maybe underestimated in the past. That is that, firstly, social demands are not new in Lebanon, far from that, and also that material demands are not political. On the contrary, material demands are very much political and intimately political in what they challenge the economic structure, the economic system, the political system. I mean, they say a lot, and many times we have looked at, for instance, partisan conflicts and political conflicts acting in the higher sphere of the political arena, while underestimating what was happening in the how to say down on the social arena. And this has been very clear during the Thawra, just to say it in the how to say the fastest way possible, that has done something that is, I think, new, which is to bring social justice issues in the very center of the political discussion and in the very center of the political priorities of people. I mean, how people express those political priorities. Well, the social question, social justice were maybe for the first time the main issue that was claimed during mobilizations, which challenged in a very strong way the confessional system in Lebanon. Yeah, well. And maybe I would have some things to say about clientelism, but maybe if there is somebody else who wants to take the floor before.
I think Shahir might want to add some thoughts.
Hi, sorry. My internet might not be the best, but I hope it doesn't cut while I'm sharing my thoughts. I honestly don't have much, but I would want to echo what Marie-Noëlle was talking about, these multi-tiered systems where we need to rethink of how we approach social protection and social security in the region. And if we want to reach universal inclusive social security systems, where there should be a holistic system, as has been echoed by colleagues in the Center for Social Sciences, is that like there should be a system which covers for that thinks about the social security system as a whole one system, rather than these fragmented systems where we are thinking about the contributory mechanisms and trying to increase people to these contributory mechanisms and focus on social insurance, to an idea that revolves around life cycle, which what we call life cycle benefits that come across the challenges from childhood till old age, something that covers all the challenges that goes in the life cycle. And then you think of a system that mixes these contributory mechanisms with tax financed contributions financed by the state to cover for child benefits, for instance, to cover for disability challenges, to cover for pensions, along with these contributory system that only benefits those who are in employment or those in working age employment. And how can you create a system that balances between those so to enforce each other? So the thinking is to address social security for all people across their life cycle challenges, rather than only thinking in one limited space here for those working. Pensions in the region has been the dominant social insurance scheme, because we have been only focused on social security for those in the employment sector, those who are working, and hence the systems that has been functioning has been pensions. Another thing I just would want to add is the level of social spending that we often miss. We often talk in this region about that we don't have enough funds and we don't have enough fiscal space. But when you look at the level and the amount of social spending as percentage of GDP compared to even middle income countries or poor countries, we are at a very, very low scale. So it's not an issue that we don't think of these tax and tax finance systems and tax finance benefits because we all often think that we don't have the resources, but it's actually how do we distribute the pie? The pie is still distributed very minimally to social spending. We still, the percentages, and I advise you even to look at the recent ILO report on the level of social spending in the region, excluding health expenditures. We are, as the MENA region, one of the lowest regions in spending, and hence we don't find the resources. So it's a political question after all, that we are spending most of our money on other things rather than on social issues. And maybe the last thing to add is that universalism is not an issue that we want to achieve tomorrow, or it's about how can we have a plan, a progressive realization plan to reach the universal coverage. And maybe this is something I can share also in the chat. We have devised a costing tool, which is something that like still we need to work on when it comes to data, but something to envision how much of these benefits can cost as percentage of GDP, because it's not as big as people assume. There is a way to reach universal across a certain timeline, across 10 to 15 years, where we can reach universal benefits with not so much higher percentages of GDP as people assume, rather than spending on these targeted schemes or targeted benefits that's actually quite expensive and with high exclusion errors, which we often don't talk about the region. We think that when we do these targeted schemes or targeted benefits, like what Lebanon, whether in the ration cards or what's the big project about the proxy mean test, we often think that this is the best use of resources, where it ends up, we miss out the majority of the poor. The best of the programs has exclusion errors of 44% of people who we want to include. So it's a very, very high errors, and the cost of it is quite high, and people don't realize this. People think that it's a safer things, while the bureaucracy of universal coverages is actually much cheaper, much ensures better targeting of better reach of the poor. And with the rich and those in the market, you can always get the money back with these taxation, and how you can bring back these resources. When you think of universal, you can get it back through tax systems. And also this is why important to think of reforming the tax system. Of course, there's more details to that, but we will soon be issuing a more detailed study on the Lebanese case studies with clear recommendations of how these costing mechanisms can look like, what is expected to be in these kind of schemes. So I hope that you can have a look on these studies once we publish it quite soon. And sorry if I took much time.
Yeah, look, I would just maybe add something. If we think that, if I'm not wrong, and I have the figure in mind, like something like 20-25% as an average has been spent in public policies and public expenditures for ADL in the last 20 years. We know that we immediately understand that there is really a necessity for interrelated reforms, also in order to find funds for a progressive plan leading to a universal coverage. So the question of finding funds and the technical proposals is, in my opinion, of course, central, but it stems from a political perspective that has to put the idea of a universal coverage as a priority, and otherwise we cannot find. Also, if we find the technical ways to achieve that, we still need the political perspective and the political priority to be matched to this technical proposals.
always political decisions, isn't it? I'm mindful of the time. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything else. Okay, well, I guess we can then wrap up. So thank you everyone for sharing all of these valuable insights on the political and the funding levels in view of conceiving a way to reform social protection and ensuring it for all residents in the country. Michele, do you want to add any final thoughts?
No, thank you. I think I said the most of it. Maybe more can be found on the policy brief that will be published shortly.
Thank you everyone for joining. The policy brief will be published shortly, and we will publish the recording of this roundtable also very soon. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.